for this recipe, we'll be preparing firecracker chicken meatballs. And we're going to be very specific about how to measure each ingredient, because we're going to pause and take time to make sure that you are aware how to properly measure all different types of ingredients. So the equipment that we need for this recipe are some baking pans. We need a large mixing bowl for the meatball mixture. We need a saucepan for the firecracker sauce, a wooden spoon. We need some dry measuring cups and measuring spoons, rubber scraper, a liquid measuring cup. We will need a garlic press and a straight edge spatula, and then parchment paper to line the pans. And I like to use gloves when mixing the meatball mixture together. So the ingredients that we'll need for our firecracker chicken meatballs are ground chicken breast. Now you can substitute that with ground turkey, and that would be just fine, but you definitely want to stick with a poultry because beef would change the flavor of the recipe quite a bit. We're going to fresh mince some garlic. We're also going to add salt, pepper, these panko breadcrumbs, which are Japanese style breadcrumb, some paprika, onion powder, some egg to bind it all together. The sauce is comprised of hot sauce, brown sugar, apple cider vinegar, salt, and red pepper flakes. All right, for this recipe, we are going to start with our sauce so that it can cook while we assemble our meatballs, and that'll give it a little bit of time to cool down and thicken while they finish off. So the first ingredient that we're going to measure is our red hot sauce, and we need 1 cup of that. So before I actually measure it, I want to go through the steps with you for measuring liquid ingredients. So I have a liquid measuring cup. You'll notice it has a pour spout. It's different than my dry measuring cups, which has a nice level edge, so I can make sure that my ingredients are leveled off and not heaping over. So we're going to measure our hot sauce in our liquid measuring cup, and to do that, we need to make sure that our measuring cup is on a level surface, so I have it on the counter. You never hold this in your hand while you're measuring because that can change the amount that it reads. So we want to be accurate so that things turn out like we expect, so it's always on a level surface. We're going to carefully pour the liquid into the measuring cup, and then we're going to bend down to eye level to check it to make sure we have the right amount. If we need a little more, we'll add that. If there's too much, we'll pour the extra back off until we get that liquid at the desired measurement mark. And then we'll pour that into our mixing container, which in this case is going to be our saucepan. And we'll make sure that we use a rubber scraper to get everything out of the measuring cup. Now, it's important to note that if you're measuring clear liquids, you need to make sure that the bottom of the meniscus, or that curve formed by the surface of the liquid, is at the mark for the amount you want. So let's go ahead and measure 1 cup of hot sauce. So I'm just going to pour this in. I always pour to the center because I don't want it to come down the side and be more than I thought after I finish. So I think that's close. So I'm going to get to eye level. It's just a little bit under that mark. So I'll add just enough, just a little bit more to get exactly 1 cup. And then for our sauce, all of our ingredients go in at the same time. So I'm going to go ahead and pour that in. And then you can see some of my ingredient was left in my measuring cup, and so that's why the rubber scraper is so important, to make sure that all of it gets in there. So the next ingredient we need to measure for our sauce is our brown sugar. Brown sugar is a dry ingredient, so we're going to use a dry measuring cup to measure it. And whenever you use a dry measuring cup, you also need a straight edge spatula. So in doing this, brown sugar, all the dry ingredients that go into measuring cups have to be handled differently, and that depends on what ingredient they are. So we always fill the ingredient so that it heaps over the top. But if it's flour or powdered sugar, we would spoon it into the measuring cup. If it were granulated sugar, we could simply scoop it up. But since it's brown sugar, we need to pack it in. And then we'll level off the top with our straight edge spatula. You can use a straight knife if you don't have one of these. And we'll let the extra fall back into the original container. And then if it's a semi-solid ingredient like peanut butter shortening or yogurt, we would need that rubber scraper again to get everything back out and into our recipe. And it's really important if you're measuring flour or powdered sugar that you never shake or tap the cup to get it level, because it packs it in and you end up with more of the ingredient than you should have. So for the brown sugar, I'm gonna put this in and I'm pressing it against the, oh goodness. I'm pressing it against the side of the container. That was exciting. To pack it in. And when you pack it, it's really important when you're packing brown sugar that you hold the cup and not the handle. Because if I hold the handle and I press to pack it in, I'm likely to break the handle off of my measuring cup. So I always hold the cup itself, or if it's a measuring spoon, I hold the bowl of the spoon. I want to pack this in. So I'm pressing all the air out of it, and then I level it off. And then whenever you are measuring brown sugar, you want to check it before you add it, and it should hold the shape of the measuring cup. And then you know that you have exactly the amount you need. I'm going to do that one more time because this recipe calls for 2 cups. And I'm pressing it against the side of the container first, and then holding the cup, not the handle, press all that air out, pack it in, level it off, and then check it to make sure it holds the shape of the cup. Now our next ingredient is apple cider vinegar, and we need 4 tablespoons of apple cider vinegar. So we need to talk about measuring small amounts, because that's what our tablespoons are, small amounts. Now the cups had a difference between liquid and dry cups. Measuring spoons are the same, whether it's a liquid or a dry ingredient. So we'll talk about small amounts of liquid right now, and we'll come back for small amounts of dry ingredients later. So we pour the liquid into the proper size measuring spoon. In this case, it's going to be our tablespoon. And we want to pour it in until it bubbles at the edge of the spoon. You want the surface tension to be what keeps it in the spoon. And so you should see no interior or inside of the spoon when that's done correctly. Now most sets are like this one. Have a tablespoon, a teaspoon, a half teaspoon, and a quarter teaspoon. So if you have to measure 1/8 of a teaspoon, then you would pour the ingredient into the quarter teaspoon measure until it was about half full. So you'd have to estimate for that 1/8. You don't see an 1/8 teaspoon measure very often, so you really don't need to spend the extra money on a set that has one if you can simply remember 1/8 is the quarter half full. All right, so let's measure some apple cider vinegar. And again, and so I measure over a custard cup so it catches any extra, and you never measure over what you're gonna mix in. So till you can see that bubble right at the edge. And then I can put it right into my pan. So there's one. So I want to show you what I mean. So I'll see people measure like this, and it kind of looks full, but you'll notice I can tip it, nothing's running out. And yet at the back here, you can see a lot of the interior of the spoon. So that means I'm missing ingredient. That's why you need that surface tension, that bubble at the edge, to be there. So you know you have as much as that spoon can hold, and then you just transfer that. So there's 2. Three. And 4. So that's all of the apple cider vinegar that we need for this recipe. And now we need to measure a small amount of a dry ingredient. And this is salt. So even though salt comes like this, I like to keep it in a small container to make it easy to measure out of. And when I'm measuring small amounts of dry ingredients, I again use those measuring spoons. And I level it off evenly at the rim of the spoon, just like I did with the brown sugar for the with the dry measuring cup. Again, I'm going to use that straight edge spatula for that task, unless my recipe calls for a heaping or a rounded measure. That means it's just a little over the top and we don't level it off. Most of the time, it doesn't call for that, so that means you level it off. Again, if you need that 1/8 of a teaspoon, you take the 1/4 teaspoon, but this time you would measure it completely, level it off, and then push half of it back out so that you have a better amount to estimate from originally. And you could just use your spatula or the tip of a knife or a rubber scraper. So our recipe today calls for a 1/2 teaspoon of salt. So again, I have that tablespoon, teaspoon, 1/2 teaspoon, and 1/4 teaspoon. And salt's very grainy, so it doesn't pack in, so I scoop it right up, level it off, and I've got that 1/2, so that's gonna go in our sauce. And then I need also red pepper flakes. And this is a range. It is a 1/2 teaspoon to 1 teaspoon, and really it depends on how spicy you like your sauce. So I'm gonna go ahead and do 1 teaspoon. And it does have this nice edge. If it was a finer ground spice, we could use that to level it off instead of the straight edge spatula. But this doesn't play nice with that straight edge, so I am gonna just, and like green leafy herbs would be the same, just lightly so that it's not heaping over. And we're gonna add that in there as well. So now we're gonna take our pan and we're gonna put it on a burner that matches the size of the pan. We're gonna put this on a medium-high heat. Stir it a little bit, allow it to come to a boil, and then reduce the heat so that it simmers. So simmer just tiny little bubbles all over the surface. And we want it to simmer for 8 to 10 minutes. That'll cook some of the liquid out, that'll help it to thicken, and then it'll thicken even more as it cools. So if it looks a little bit thin at the beginning, if you choose to make this, don't worry right away. It's gonna thicken as it cools down and it'll be easier to work with. So for the meatballs themselves, we're gonna start with some ground chicken. Just gonna cut that out of its package. And we do need 2 pounds. Each package is a pound. So that's pretty easy. And like I said earlier, you could use ground turkey. Really, I'd go with whatever's on sale. You could even do a combination of the two. All right, so we're gonna put our ground chicken in there. We're gonna add 4 teaspoons of minced garlic. And I've already minced most of it. So to mince your garlic, you have a couple of options. If you have one, I really like the garlic press. And so to do that, you take your clove of garlic. So this is a clove. When it's all together, this is a bulb. Sometimes people will refer to this as a clove, but it's really just this small piece because you don't want to get that confused. That's a big difference. So we're gonna peel it. And the easiest way to peel it is to press, and that loosens that outer skin to make it a little bit easier to get off. Then it goes into the garlic press and you simply squeeze and push. Now, if you don't have a garlic press, you could mince it with a chef's knife on a cutting board. If you have like a nut chopper, that would work also. But I like the garlic press the most because it cuts it very small and fine, very quickly and very easily. So now we also need 1½ teaspoon. I'm gonna set this to the side. 1½ teaspoons of salt. And we're gonna use our straight edge spatula. Oh, that's a tablespoon. All right, so 1 teaspoon, we're gonna scoop it up, heap it over, level it off, sprinkle that all around. And then also a 1/2 teaspoon, scoop it up, heap it over, level it off. Just like we did earlier with the salt. This recipe also calls for a teaspoon of pepper. So you can see I've got that straight edge. Now if your spoon fits, see that would work, but this is a little big. So I could do a 1/2 teaspoon twice. Nope, that was not gonna work. So we're gonna take the top off. And we'll use our straight edge spatula. Scoop it up, heap it over, level it off. 1 teaspoon of pepper. Now we also need 1 cup of panko breadcrumbs. And I'm going to measure that over a bowl so that if I get more than I need, I don't make a mess. Then we're going to just kind of push that gently to level it off so we have a cup. Add that. Our next ingredient is a 1/2 teaspoon of paprika, and this has a much larger space. So we'll be able to take that 1/2 teaspoon right into that jar, and then we'll just use that edge as our straight edge spatula to level it. And then 1 teaspoon of onion powder. We're going to use our straight edge spatula to level that off as it comes out. Now I have one more ingredient I need to add to this, and that's to help hold everything together. And that's going to be our egg. So I'm going to crack the egg into a custard cup. That way if there's any problem with the egg, all I have to replace is the egg and not everything that's already in this bowl. It's a lot cheaper to replace 1 egg than 2 pounds of chicken and everything else that goes with it. So we just need 2 eggs in our recipe, and then in just a minute we're going to mix this all together. Alright, so now we're going to mix our meatball mixture all together, but before I start mixing that, I want to make sure my pan is ready to go. So I have a piece of parchment paper. If you did not have parchment paper, you could use aluminum foil and cooking spray. But with the parchment paper, you don't need the cooking spray. So what we're going to do is we're going to make this fit the pan. So this is a paper designed to be in the oven, but we don't want it all over. So we're going to fold the edge so that it just fits inside the pan. We want it to go edge to edge. All right. If you didn't want to fold it, you could cut it. That would work as well. Get this last side here. So now this is all ready to put the meatballs on. And I have a second pan in case I should need it. So we're going to mix this all together. You could use a wooden spoon, you could use a rubber scraper. Your hands are recommended because you really get a better feel of how well things are mixed together. And you want to make sure that you don't over mix it. Now you could do it just with your hands plain, but I like the gloves because it just makes it a little less messy to me for some reason. So we want to make sure we get it all mixed together well. We want breadcrumbs everywhere, and you won't see the egg anymore. It should just look like all one mixture. We shouldn't see pieces of any of it. You don't want to see salt or pepper off to the side. You can see it's really gloppy and sticky. So again, that's why I like the gloves. Just makes it a little nicer to work with. Okay, if we overmix it, it results in a drier meatball, so we want to avoid that. Now we need to form this into those meatballs. And we want to make sure that they stay all about the same size, because that makes them cook at the same rate. So we want to, about 2 tablespoons of meat mixture per ball. And so you can just guess, you can just estimate, that's fine. You could use measuring spoons, but what I like, because I feel like it makes it really easy, is a cookie scoop. So there's a cookie scoop, kind of roll that loosely, and then we're going to do that till all the mixture is in on the baking pan and ready to go. So while I finish rolling some of these, let me go over some other ingredients that you will measure often, because really this video is about measuring, but we just happen to be making something delicious in the process. So we didn't really have any fats in our recipe today, no specific, no butter, margarine, or shortening. So I want to talk about those. If you had margarine or butter, you can use the stick method for measuring. And when you use the stick method, you simply cut off the margarine or butter using the markings on the wrapper. If you were measuring shortening or peanut butter or something along that line, you would put that in a dry measuring cup and you would pack it down, very similar to how we did the brown sugar for this recipe, to get all the air bubbles out. And so you would press it firmly to eliminate those air bubbles. So put it enough in so it heaps over the top. Level it off, and then use a rubber scraper to get it out like we did the hot sauce, so that all of the ingredient gets into your mixing bowl. Now, there is a fancy tool that I like to keep around in my kitchen called a Wonder Cup, and it's great for measuring fats and semi-solid ingredients, because you simply, it's a lot easier to do when your hands aren't covered in chicken, but you simply press that down to the mark that you need, pack it in. You can see if you have air bubbles and eliminate them, and then when you're ready to add it, you just press the bottom and it cleans it all out. So I love the Wonder Cup, but it's really just a fancy dry measuring cup, so it's not something you have to have, but it's a nice luxury item for any kitchen. And then a couple more general reminders with measuring. You should always stir your ingredients before you measure them, especially things like flour and powdered sugar, because they tend to pack down even just sitting still over time. And if a recipe calls for you to do something to an ingredient, it's very important to note where the verb is in comparison to the ingredient. So, for example, if a recipe tells you to have sifted flour, that puts the verb before the ingredient, which means you would sift the flour before you measure. So if the verb comes before the ingredient, you perform the action before measuring. And if it's after, like 1 cup of walnuts, chopped, you measure and then perform the action. So if the verb is after the ingredient, you measure first. Okay, so I'm going to finish shaping these meatballs, and then we'll talk about the next step. All right, so now we have a full tray of meatballs ready to go in the oven, and our recipe says that they should bake for 8 to 12 minutes. Anytime a recipe gives you a range, you always set the timer for the lowest amount of time, because you can look, you can check them, and you can always add time, but you can never unbake them if it was too much. So we're going to put these in the oven, and we're going to set it for 8 minutes. After the meatballs have baked for about 8 to 12 minutes, then you're going to take that sauce And we're gonna coat. You could dip them, or you can simply brush them so they're covered with the sauce. And this is where that parchment paper or that sprayed foil becomes really important, because if you don't have it on a surface like that, you are gonna spend a lot of time afterwards cleaning that pan. So we're just gonna brush each of these with sauce, completely cover them, and then we're gonna put them back in the oven for another minute or two, and then we'll serve them with any additional sauce as a side. So we'll finish these up and put them back in the oven, and then when they're ready to serve, we'll look at that. So once they've had another minute or two to bake with the sauce on, then they're ready to serve, and you can take that additional sauce, and I like to serve them with toothpicks. Then people can add sauce to their liking, and it's ready to eat. Firecracker chicken meatballs are a great appetizer when you're looking for something different to share.